It's hard to argue that the 1960s, in particular, roughly 1963 through, let's say, 1969, even into 1970, were really peak Pontiac and the height of the Pontiac Motor Division. 1968 was, in fact, Pontiac's best year to date, but around this time frame, all Pontiacs were pretty awesome. I have to say my favorite year for Pontiac is actually 1965, and in that model year, the entire Pontiac lineup was named Motor Trend's Car of the Year. The big cars, the small cars, everything in between. I shouldn't call them small. I'll call them senior compacts, shall we say. In any case, 65 was a banner year for Pontiac, but 1967 was also a great year for Pontiac, although the division had different styling up front than they did in previous years. Now, one of the things about 1967 is that it also saw the introduction of what may be Pontiac's shortest-lived nameplate. I'm struggling to think of one that was shorter-lived, but maybe there is one. Put a comment in the comment section if you can think of one. And that is the Executive line. Now, the Executive line ran from 1967 through the 1970 model year, and after that, it was done. Basically, for 1971, Pontiac slotted the Bonneville in as the mid-level car. The Granville became the top car, and the Catalina was the entry-level vehicle. So you had the Catalina, the Bonneville, and then the Granville in 1971. But in 1967, you had the Catalina. Then you had one up from that was the Executive, and then the Bonneville was the top trim, of course. Now, the Executive has an interesting history because, as I said, it only lasted from 1967 through 1970. But Pontiac really did a curious thing for 1966, and that is that it kind of transitioned its mid-level car from being the Star Chief in 1965 to the Executive in 1967 by having the mouthful model in 1966, the Star Chief Executive. So as opposed to just dropping the Star Chief name after 1965, as I mentioned, Pontiac decided that they had to have that in-between kind of tweener name, the Star Chief Executive, only for the 1966 model year before they flipped it to the Executive for 1967. Now let's take a look at this particular 1967 Pontiac Executive. And this one has only 13,000 original miles on it. And it's finished in a color, I believe, that's called Linden Green. And maybe that's because these cars were produced in Linden, New Jersey, which I guess has a lot of this pale green color associated with it. In any case, notice the very bold Pontiac front end here for 1967. And it was a little bit different, still a stacked headlamp Pontiac, but different from the 1965 and 1966 models. And that is in part because the 67 front end was designed in the Advanced Studios and not in the regular Pontiac production studios. Check out my channel for a video interview with Dick Rusin on this, and you can see more about the history of the 67 Pontiac front end. Here's an original sketch that was used to develop the front end, and you can see the similarity between the sketch and the final result. Now, as I said before, this is still a stacked headlamp Pontiac, but you have kind of this very bold loop-style grille. The loop bumper was coming into vogue in this time frame. A lot of different car companies and divisions would have loop bumpers, everyone from Chevrolet to Chrysler. And again, it was just a popular look. Here, Pontiac just has it on the lower portion of the front end. And you have these slots that make up the grills, very similar to what you saw on the 1962 Grand Prix as an example, and relevant Pontiacs of that era. Now, of course, you have this very pointy-like arrowhead form up front that was typical and synonymous with Pontiac during this era. But I love that aside from the little shoulders there that form that arrowhead and then the crease that runs down the midsection of the hood and how it transitions into the top of the fender is smooth. There's no crease there. It's just like the car kind of magically gets taller as you go to the outer ends of it. And that transition to me is a very sensual one, and I just love it. It's this very deftly and, let's say, lightly filleted surface that creates that. I also love the twisting and turning of the surface of the arrowhead and how it comes toward the point up front. That surface and how it's reflecting the light must have taken designers an inordinately long period of time to get correct, because that shoulder is just kind of moving and growing and twisting, and I have to say it looks absolutely fantastic. By the way, I will point out that the Pontiac studio themselves did a genius job of turning the front end into a Grand Prix front end by eliminating the upper headlamp and making it kind of the shark-like gills up top for the turn signal, and then putting the headlights behind a headlight cover so they were hidden on the lower portion of the grille. Very authoritative front end. And all that Pontiac had to do was change that little end cap up at the top and then change the lower portion of the grille, and everything else could stay the same. The hood could stay the same. The midsection there could stay the same. It was a genius and cost-effective way to get an entirely different look to the front end. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why you see that end cap there that is encapsulating the top headlamps, because it was just easier to manufacture and easier to change for the Grand Prix. And now as we transition to this front three-quarter view, maybe another reason for the end cap was also just manufacturability. It's probably much easier to stamp that fender as is, and you can see here the fender and how it's shaped from the leading edge of the door to that end cap up front. And I can imagine trying to get that metal up front to bend around and twist so that it could form that headlamp bucket was also a challenge. So the Pontiac engineers kind of got a twofer there. They got the easier to stamp fender as well as a new look for the Grand Prix because of that. Now you also do see this very distinctive and, let's say, sharp body side crease that has a pretty pronounced highlight on top and a low light or shadow on the bottom. And I wonder what this car, imagine that it didn't have that crease and how, let's say, hefty the body side would look. The crease kind of serves to break that up. I do love that skeg line that starts in the door and then forms the fender skirt. It's just a cool look for these particular vehicles. And then you have, of course, the so-called Coke bottle styling that we've talked about a number of times before, where that sheet metal is flaring outward and upward and downward around the rear wheel. Very typical style, particularly for GM during this time frame. Now, as we transition here to the side view, we can see this beautiful arc of the fastback roofline for this 67 Executive two-door hardtop. Take a look at how big that rear quarter glass is, too, on this car. It's enormous because of that very gentle arc to the roof, and I love how it flows into the deck lid. And it kind of inverts. It's almost like a swage line, this S line that you see that starts at the A pillar and then runs back, let's say, toward the rear of the car, down the C pillar, and then forms the deck lid. See that S-like form? And it's complementing kind of an inverted S that if you look at the top of the quarter panel and take your eye toward the front of the car, you can see an S running in inverse. So this car has all of these little S curves that give it some visual interest, particularly in the side view, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. Now, I do note in this picture a very slight difference in the paint between the door and the fender. The fender looks a little bit darker than the door. And that could be perfectly factory. You actually see that a fair amount on General Motors cars of the era because Fisher Body Division owned the body from the cowl rearward, and the division owned the sheet metal and the painting from the cowl forward. And as a result, sometimes these parts were painted in two different assembly plants or portions of the assembly plant. There was actually a line on the floor in a lot of the assembly plants where on one side it was Fisher Body Division, on the other it was the division itself that operated the plant. This is before GM Assembly Division came about. And so sometimes you get a paint mismatch just because it could even be the same paint formulation, but the temperature and the humidity is different, and that makes the paint lay differently and the metallic flake look a little different. So you see this relatively commonly on GM cars of the era, and that's one of the reasons why. So if you see that on a car that you're looking to buy and the paint, let's say, checks out to being between 2.5 and 4.5 mils thick, it's original paint. That's just how they were painted back in the day. Now, as we rotate to the rear three-quarter view, this to me is perhaps the most dramatic of the views on this car because you have that beautiful arcing roof, and you have what is a convex curve up at the top, kind of inverting to a concave curve as it transitions into the deck lid. Then you have that's one S curve. Then you have the other inverted S that I talked about, the quarter panel and that top of the quarter panel line going forward. You have the Coke bottle styling. You have these tail lamps that kind of drape over and spill downward And you have this deck lid that really has no creases to it except where it folds, of course, to meet the trim panel that's housing the tail lamps and that particular area there. But this is such a clean car with, I would just call it unbroken, steady lines, and everything just works beautifully. I love how the bumper continues the quarter panel form in it on the side there. And that end section is just fantastic, and how this car tapers oh so gradually all the way from the highest portion of the roof down to the rearmost portion of the deck lid. It's absolutely fantastic and just emblematic of how great of stylists and clay modelers General Motors had during this time period. These were really fine artists. The division leader, or the leader of the design studios for Pontiac this time, was a man by the name of Jack Humbert. Extremely talented person. He became Pontiac's chief designer in the early 1960s after having been an interior designer for a number of years. So he just had a great attention to detail for all these complicated surfaces that you see here. Now, as we transition to the interior of this 67 Executive, 1967 was really the year where I would say GM Interiors started to go a little bit downhill. 68 was even more pronounced. But in 1967, you can see that this isn't quite as adorned, or at least in my opinion, as detailed as the 66 Star Chief Executive interior. It still looks good, though, and I have to say the wood grain here is a nice touch. The door panels aren't bad. The seats look a little bit plain, but they do have stitching on them that looks nice. But overall, it's just not quite the same as the 65 and 66 that had those beautiful 3 rotated pods that were facing the driver, where on this car the center air vent is. On the 65 and the 66, instead, if you got air conditioning, which this car has, that center air vent was in the IP top pad and was riding atop it. My guess is they wanted to commonize the IP top pad across all variants, and then that pushed that barrel vent into the middle of the dash as opposed to being able to be on top of it. In fact, in 65 and 6, there were multiple variants of that IP top pad. There was the one for no AC cars, there was one for the AC cars, then there was one for the AC cars with the auto climate control, 3 different top pads. So my guess is the bean counter said no more, and we will give you a cost savings here if you just use one. You also have perhaps another cost savings move, which is that the glove box is designed into the IP here as opposed to the lower portion of the IP like it was in 65 and 66. You notice that big door with the button on it where it says Executive, that's the glove box. In 65 and 6, there was a glove box that would have been underneath that. There would have been a grab handle, as an example, in that area, and some beautiful trim. But alas, you don't have that here. It still looks good, like I said, and you have the Pontiac, I'll call it dual radio control style controls, one for the radio, truthfully. Then you have the cigarette lighter to the left of the 2 radio controls. Then to the left of that is the Pontiac heater, which the leftmost control is for the fan speed, the rightmost is for the temperature. And on an air conditioning equipped car, obviously, I guess I should call it Pontiac heating and air conditioning. If it were just a car that was not equipped with AC, you would say Pontiac heater there. This car also does not have the deluxe seat belts. These are just the standard seat belts that came in black no matter what the interior color was. And you also notice in the kick wells, there are no vents down there because this is an air conditioning equipped car. Chrysler liked to leave those vents still in the kick wells. Even if you got air conditioning, GM and Ford generally took them out. And of course, you have the crotch cooler vents in the lower portion of the dash as well. And for a close-up of the dash, you can see the 13,000 original miles on this car. And notice the control there, the HVAC control. It's on full cold, although the button for off is depressed. This was an interesting style of control because you had, if you push normal, and then you could change the blower speed basically between low, medium, and high. But the blower speed would change based on how cold you turned the temperature dial, something that I haven't seen really done on other cars. So it wasn't really automatic climate control, but they were kind of making it cool in that it not only affected the temperature, but also the blower. There were multiple speeds for the blower, even once you selected the blower speed with the leftmost rotating knob as you move the temperature dial. Other interesting thing about this car is that you have the Indian Chief logo there under the 60-mile-an-hour marking, and that was the bright light indicator. So when you turn the bright lights on, that glows red, and you have the Pontiac Indian Chief logo there. And for whatever reason, in that gauge pod, the speedometer pod, the designers or whoever thought it was most important to have the fuel gauge and then the battery charging and discharging gauge as opposed to a temperature gauge. I am not sure why, but that is what they thought was most important. And as we look at the seats one more time, a little bit plain, but not too bad. I think overall, a handsome vehicle. Now, one thing that was a strong point of your Pontiac during this era was the trunk space. This trunk looks mint. It's about 20 cubic feet. It wasn't very tall because of the fastback roofline, but you can certainly accommodate a lot in this trunk just given how big the car was. Remember, the Executive was the big Pontiac. The Catalina and the Grand Prix to this point were really the smaller Pontiacs. The Executive was the large one. And so you got even more space in the trunk on these because the car was just bigger. More specifically, the Executive in Bonneville rode atop 124-inch wheelbase. The Catalina, as an example, and the Grand Prix rode atop 121-inch wheelbase. And now we come to the underhood area for this Executive. Now, the standard engine for the Executives with the automatic transmission was a 290 horsepower, 400 cubic inch Pontiac V8 breathing through a two-barrel carburetor, and was a high compression engine. That was what you got if you had a standard automatic transmission once again. And depending on the model, it's kind of humorous. You could get anything from a 229 rear end to 241 to 256. This being an air conditioning equipped car and a two-door Executive hardtop. I believe this has a 256 to 1 rear end. So super, super lazy and tall rear ends, a 229 to 1 rear end in this. And while that sounds like, the thing would be a slug, I got to tell you, driving these Pontiac V8s with those super tall rear ends, they are not. They are still peppy, amazingly. It is not a slug. And in fact, you get great fuel economy with them as a consequence on the freeway. My 66 Catalina on the freeway with the 389 and the 256 to 1 rear end, I would say I get 17, 18 miles per gallon on the freeway. It's pretty gosh darn good for what the car is. So that was the standard engine in the Executives. Then one up from that was an optional 325 horsepower, 400 cubic inch V8 topped by a 4-barrel carburetor. Then there was the 360 horsepower, 428 cubic inch V8 topped by a 4-barrel carburetor. And the top engine that you could get was a 376 horsepower, 428 cubic inch engine topped by a 4-barrel carburetor. Now, you notice I said 4-barrel carburetor a lot there. That's because Pontiac no longer had the 3 deuces or 3 2-barrel carburetors after 1966, likely because they introduced the quadrajet carburetor for 1967, and it could flow enough air and fuel that the 3 2-barrels weren't needed, and the quadrajet just being a single 4-barrel was less complicated and more reliable. And optional at no extra cost on Pontiacs, you could get a 265 horsepower, 400 cubic inch engine. It was a low compression engine topped by a 2-barrel carburetor. Hard to say which engine is in this particular Executive. They both look the same with the same air cleaner. You'd have to take a look at the engine codes, the 2-letter code that is underneath the passenger side cylinder head stamped into the block to understand which particular engine this one has. So it could have either the 265 or 290 horsepower, 400 cubic inch V8 underhood. Either one, propels these cars pretty gosh darn well. So what do you think of this gorgeous 1967 Pontiac Executive, as well as the Executive nameplate and how Pontiac transitioned from the Star Chief to the Star Chief Executive to the Executive? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.